Stand on the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral today, and you can see across a skyline of steel and glass stretching to the Thames. More than 8 million people call this city home. But rewind 358 years, and you would have found a medieval tinderbox of timber and thatch, crammed with 80,000 souls who had never seen a street wider than a cart. Fire, ash, smoke. Rebirth. Using cutting-edge AI reconstruction, we are about to walk you through every hour of the Great Fire of London, from the spark in a bakery on Pudding Lane to the city Christopher Wren raised from its ruins. This is the story of 4 days in September 1666 that erased 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and the entire heart of the capital. A catastrophe so complete that King Charles II himself stood in the streets with a bucket. A city that burned so hot the stones exploded, and a disaster that accidentally built modern London. London in 1666 was not the London you know. The city that would burn was a medieval survivor, a place where Roman walls still defined the boundaries and half-timbered houses leaned so far into the streets that neighbors could shake hands across the gap. The Great Plague had killed 70,000 people just a year before. Mass graves still lay fresh in the churchyards. The city was recovering, but it was fragile, and it was built almost entirely of wood. Samuel Pepys, the naval administrator whose diary would become the defining account of the fire, lived on Seething Lane in a house pressed against dozens of others in the labyrinth east of the tower. The streets were narrow, some barely 6 feet wide. There were no building codes, no fire brigade, no insurance. Water came from the Thames or from public conduits fed by wooden pipes. When a fire broke out, neighbors formed bucket chains and pulled down houses with hooks to create fire breaks. It was a system that had worked for centuries, until it did not. The summer of 1666 had been the driest in living memory. By early September, the timber frames and thatched roofs were as dry as kindling. The River Fleet, which ran through the western edge of the city, was nearly empty. The Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was a wealthy merchant who had bought his way into office and was widely considered incompetent. He would soon prove it. The city held perhaps 80,000 people within the walls and another 100,000 in the sprawling suburbs beyond. It was one of the largest cities in Europe, and it had survived the plague. But no one was prepared for what was about to happen in a bakery on Pudding Lane, just north of London Bridge, where a man named Thomas Farriner baked ship's biscuit for the Royal Navy. Shortly after midnight on Sunday, September 2nd, 1666, Thomas Farriner woke to smoke. His bakery on Pudding Lane, a narrow street near the northern end of London Bridge, was on fire. Farriner later testified that he had checked his ovens before bed and found them cold. But something, a stray ember, a smouldering beam, had ignited in the hours after midnight. Farriner, his daughter, and a servant escaped through an upstairs window and climbed across rooftops. A maid, too frightened to follow, became the fire's first victim. The flames spread quickly. Pudding Lane was lined with wooden warehouses storing tallow, oil, and spirits for the ships that docked along the Thames. The buildings were jammed together. The fire leapt from house to house. By 3 in the morning, the blaze had consumed the Star Inn and was moving west toward Fish Street Hill. Samuel Pepys was woken at 3 by his maid. He looked out the window, saw the glow, and went back to bed. Fires were common. This one seemed far away. By dawn, the fire had reached the Thames waterfront and was feeding on the timber yards and coal stores that lined the wharves. The wind, blowing strong from the east, pushed the flames deeper into the city. Pepys woke again at 7 and climbed the Tower of London to get a better view. He saw 300 houses burning. He took a boat onto the river and watched people throwing their possessions into the water, trying to save what they could. He rode to Whitehall Palace and informed King Charles II. The king ordered the Lord Mayor to pull down houses to create fire breaks. Pepys found Bloodworth in the streets near Cannon Street, exhausted and overwhelmed. The mayor had been fighting the fire all night. When Pepys relayed the king's command, Bloodworth snapped back, "Lord, what can I do? I am spent. People will not obey me. I have been pulling down houses, but the fire overtakes us faster than we can do it." Then he said the words that would define his legacy: "A woman might piss it out." He refused to order more demolitions. He was afraid of being held liable for the destruction. By noon on Sunday, the fire was out of control. It had crossed Fish Street Hill and was racing west along Thames Street, consuming the warehouses and guild halls that lined the river. The heat was so intense that it shattered the stones of London Bridge. Refugees began to flee east toward Moorfields and north toward Islington, carrying their belongings on carts and boats. By Sunday afternoon, the fire had become a living thing. It moved faster than a man could run, propelled by the east wind and fed by centuries of timber construction. The flames reached Gracechurch Street and began to devour the commercial heart of the city. The Royal Exchange, where merchants had traded for 100 years, was surrounded. Lombard Street, lined with the houses of goldsmiths and bankers, was in the path of the blaze. Pepys spent Sunday securing his own valuables. He dug a pit in his garden and buried his wine and his Parmesan cheese. He sent his money and important papers to a friend in Bethnal Green. Then he returned to the river to watch. The Thames was choked with boats. Thousands of people were trying to evacuate, piling furniture, clothing, and children into anything that floated. Pepys wrote that the river looked like a fleet at anchor, so dense were the vessels. On the north bank, the fire was now a mile wide. It moved in waves, leaping across streets, climbing church towers, exploding through warehouses. The heat generated its own wind. Witnesses reported that burning embers were carried half a mile ahead of the main blaze, starting new fires before the old ones had even arrived. By Sunday evening, the fire had reached Cheapside, the main east-west artery of the city. The Guildhall, the seat of city government, was threatened. So was St. Paul's Cathedral, the largest building in England, its medieval spire visible from 10 miles away. The cathedral's massive stone walls and lead roof were thought to be fireproof. Booksellers and stationers had carried their entire inventories into the crypt for safekeeping. They were wrong. King Charles II and his brother James, Duke of York, took personal command of the firefighting efforts. The king rode through the streets on horseback, ordering demolitions and handing out coins to exhausted workers. James organized fire posts at key locations, each manned by 30 men with buckets, axes, and hooks. They worked through the night, but the fire moved faster. By Monday morning, the flames had crossed into the western half of the city. The Guildhall was on fire, its oak beams collapsing into a shell of scorched stone. The Royal Exchange was gone. Baynard's Castle, a Norman fortress on the riverfront, was consumed in minutes. And the fire was now advancing on St. Paul's. The cathedral stood on the highest point in the city, surrounded by a churchyard and streets. But those streets were lined with timber-framed houses and shops, many of them leaning against the cathedral's outer walls. The booksellers had stacked thousands of volumes in the crypt, along with wooden shelving and packing materials. On Monday afternoon, the fire reached St. Paul's. The lead roof, weighing hundreds of tons, began to melt. Molten lead poured into the streets, running in rivers down Ludgate Hill. The stones exploded from the heat. Pepys wrote that the cathedral burned in a most horrid, malicious, bloody flame, not like the flame of an ordinary fire. The medieval building that had stood for 600 years was gutted in a single afternoon. Its roof collapsed. Its walls cracked. The books in the crypt were incinerated. When the fire finally passed, only the outer shell remained, blackened and hollow, a skeleton against the sky. By Monday night, the fire had consumed the entire eastern half of the city and was pushing west and north with terrifying speed. The flames had crossed the River Fleet and were advancing on the legal district around Fleet Street and the wealthy neighborhoods of Holborn. The firestorm had grown so large that it created its own weather. Witnesses reported whirlwinds of flame, columns of smoke that rose miles into the sky, and a roar so loud it drowned out human voices. The heat was unbearable even at a distance. Pepys wrote that he could feel the scorching on his face from across the river in Southwark. The air was thick with ash. Burning fragments rained down on towns 10 miles outside London. In Westminster, 2 miles west of the main blaze, people watched the sky turn orange and prepared to evacuate. The King and the Duke of York continued to lead the firefighting efforts in person, but by Tuesday morning, it was clear that the city could not be saved by buckets and hooks. The only hope was to create fire breaks wide enough that the flames could not leap across them. Charles ordered the use of gunpowder to demolish entire streets of houses in the path of the fire. It was a desperate measure. Gunpowder was dangerous, and there was a risk of spreading the fire further if the explosions were mistimed, but there was no alternative. The demolition teams worked through Tuesday, blowing up houses on Cheapside, Watling Street, and the approaches to Fleet Street. The explosions shook the ground. Great clouds of dust and debris rose into the smoke-filled sky. Slowly, painfully, the fire breaks began to take effect. But the fire was not done. On Tuesday afternoon, it made one final terrible push. It crossed the Fleet River, which many had hoped would act as a natural barrier, and surged into the Temple, the headquarters of the legal profession. The Inner Temple and Middle Temple, with their ancient halls and libraries, were consumed. The flames reached Fleet Street and began to advance on Fetter Lane and Shoe Lane. If the fire broke through here, it would reach the wealthy western suburbs and continue unchecked toward Westminster and Whitehall. The King's own palace would be in danger. The Duke of York stationed himself at the Fleet Street firebreak with 100 men. They worked through Tuesday night, demolishing houses and dousing embers, fighting to hold the line. At Cripplegate, in the north of the city, another firebreak was being defended by exhausted citizens and troops. The fire was encircling them, smoke blotted out the sun. The heat was unbearable. And then on Wednesday morning, the wind dropped. The relentless east wind that had driven the fire for 3 days suddenly died to a breeze. The flames, deprived of their momentum, began to slow. The fire breaks held. By Wednesday afternoon, the main blaze was under control. Small fires continued to burn for days, flaring up in cellars and ruins, but the unstoppable advance had been stopped. On Thursday, September 6th, 4 days after it began, the Great Fire of London was finally declared over. The city that emerged from the smoke was unrecognizable. 13,000 houses had been destroyed. 87 parish churches were gone. 44 guild halls had burned. The Guildhall was a ruin. The Royal Exchange was rubble. St. Paul's Cathedral was a blackened shell. 436 acres within the city walls, more than 80% of the total area, had been erased. The medieval city that had stood for 1,000 years was gone, and yet, miraculously, the death toll was astonishingly low. Official records listed only 6 confirmed deaths, though modern historians believe the true number was higher, perhaps in the dozens or low hundreds. Many bodies were likely incinerated beyond recognition or buried in the chaos. But there was no massacre, no mass graves. The fire had destroyed the city, but it had not slaughtered its people. The human cost was in displacement and ruin. 70,000 people, nearly the entire population within the walls, were homeless. Refugee camps sprang up in Moorfields, Islington, and Highgate. Tents and makeshift shelters filled the fields. The King ordered the surrounding towns to take in refugees and provide food. Parliament opened an emergency relief fund. But the scale of the disaster was overwhelming. People had lost everything: their homes, their businesses, their livelihoods. Goldsmiths had seen their fortunes melt in the vaults of Lombard Street. Booksellers had watched centuries of knowledge burn in the crypt of St. Paul's, and everyone wanted someone to blame. Rumors spread immediately that the fire had been started deliberately. Catholics were accused. French spies were arrested. A French watchmaker named Robert Hubert confessed to starting the fire and was hanged at Tyburn in October, though he was almost certainly innocent and possibly mentally ill. He had not even been in London when the fire started. The paranoia was fed by the ongoing war with France and the Netherlands, and by the deep anti-Catholic sentiment that ran through English society. The official investigation found no evidence of arson, but many Londoners refused to believe it. The monument, a column erected later to commemorate the fire, originally carried an inscription blaming the treachery and malice of the Popish faction. It remained there for more than a century. Thomas Farriner, the baker whose oven had been the source of the spark, was never charged. The fire was officially ruled an accident. But the question everyone was asking was not who started it. It was what would happen next. Before the embers had cooled, plans for rebuilding were already being drawn. King Charles II understood that this was an opportunity. The medieval city was gone. A new London could rise in its place, planned, rational, fireproof. Within days, the king issued a proclamation banning timber construction and requiring all new buildings to be made of brick or stone. He called for architects to submit plans for the rebuilding of the city. Christopher Wren, a young astronomer and architect who had recently returned from Paris, presented a bold vision: a city of wide boulevards radiating from central piazzas, with the Thames as its grand axis and a new St. Paul's Cathedral at its heart. His plan was beautiful. It was baroque. It was utterly impractical. London was not a blank slate. Property lines, ancient rights, and a web of ownership claims stretched back centuries. Landowners demanded to rebuild on their old plots. Merchants needed to reopen their businesses immediately. The medieval street plan, for all its chaos, was embedded in the legal and economic fabric of the city. Wren's grand plan was quietly shelved. So were proposals by John Evelyn and Robert Hooke. The city that rose from the ashes would follow the old medieval pattern, with a few crucial differences. The streets were widened, timber was banned, buildings were required to meet new standards of height and materials. The Rebuilding Act of 1667 laid out strict regulations for construction and created a framework for compensating property owners. And Christopher Wren, though his utopian vision had been rejected, was given the commission of a lifetime: the rebuilding of St. Paul's Cathedral and 51 parish churches across the city. Over the next 4 decades, Wren would transform the London skyline. His new St. Paul's, crowned with its iconic dome, would become the defining symbol of the city. His parish churches, elegant, inventive, each one different, would punctuate every neighborhood. And his monument, a stone column 202 feet tall, would stand on Pudding Lane, marking the place where the fire began. Walk through the City of London today, and you are walking through the fire's legacy. The street plan beneath your feet is medieval, but the buildings are not. The churches are Wren's. The monument still stands on Pudding Lane, a stone reminder of the 4 days that changed everything. The fire destroyed the old city, but it made the new one possible. It forced London to rebuild in stone and brick, creating a city that could withstand future blazes. It cleared away the medieval tangle and made room for the Georgian squares and Victorian streets that would come later. And it gave the world one of Christopher Wren's greatest masterpieces, a cathedral dome that still defines the skyline 3.5 centuries later. The Great Fire of London killed fewer than 100 people, but it erased 1,000 years of history in 4 days. And from those ashes, it built a city that refused to die. London burned, London rebuilt, London endured.